The September morning started like any other Saturday in Riverside County. I was in my front yard, wearing an old college t-shirt and paint-stained jeans, finally tackling the fence repair I'd been putting off for months. My name is Robert Mitchell, and if you saw me that morning, you'd never guess what I do for a living. That's exactly how I prefer it on weekends. The wood panels were splintering, and I was focused on measuring the replacement boards when I heard the screech of tires followed by a car door slamming with unnecessary force. "Excuse me! Excuse me!" The voice cut through the peaceful suburban morning like a fire alarm. I looked up to see a woman in her mid-50s marching across my lawn, actually walking directly on my grass, which I'd just reseeded 2 weeks ago. She was wearing a designer tracksuit that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, oversized sunglasses perched on her head, and an expression that could curdle milk. Her blonde highlights caught the sunlight as she stomped toward me, cell phone clutched in one perfectly manicured hand. I set down my measuring tape and straightened up, already feeling the familiar tension that comes from neighborhood confrontations. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral and friendly. Years of experience had taught me that most conflicts could be de-escalated with a calm demeanor. "Help me? Help me?" She stopped about 3 feet away, hands on her hips. "You can start by explaining why your tree is dropping leaves all over my property. Do you have any idea how much time I spend cleaning up after your negligence?" She gestured dramatically toward the large oak tree that straddled the property line between my house and the one next door, the house she'd apparently just moved into, based on the moving truck I'd seen there last week. I glanced at the oak tree, which had been there for probably 50 years, long before either of our houses existed. "Ma'am, I'm sorry you're frustrated, but that tree is actually on the property line. According to county records, we both share responsibility for it, and it's—" "Don't ma'am me," she interrupted, her voice rising. "I'm Rebecca Hartwell, and I didn't pay $1.2 million for a house just to deal with your tree destroying my property value. I want it removed, today." I took a slow breath. "I understand you're upset, Mrs. Hartwell, but that tree is protected under county ordinances. It's over 100 years old and classified as heritage vegetation. Neither of us can remove it without—" "I don't care about your ordinances." Rebecca pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of me, of my yard, of the tree. "I'm documenting everything. Everything. You're going to remove that tree, or I'm going to make your life absolutely miserable. I have lawyers, I have connections, and I don't lose." Something about the way she said it made my jaw clench. I've spent 15 years on the bench, and I'd seen this type before. People who believed money and volume could override law and reason. But she didn't know who I was. In my weekend clothes with sawdust in my hair, I was just another neighbor to bully. "Mrs. Hartwell," I said carefully, "I'm not removing a heritage tree that we both benefit from. If you'd like to discuss this calmly, I'm happy to show you the property records and the county conservation code. The tree stays, but I'm willing to talk about a shared maintenance schedule for the leaves." Her face turned an impressive shade of crimson. "Oh, you're willing to talk? How generous of you." She stepped closer, her phone now recording video. "Let me tell you something, Mr." She paused, realizing she didn't know my name. "Mitchell. Robert Mitchell." "Mr. Mitchell," she sneered. "I've dealt with people like you my whole life, people who think they can just do whatever they want without consequences. Well, guess what? I'm going to sue you. I'm going to take you to court, and I'm going to make you pay for every single leaf that falls on my property. I'm going to sue you for property damage, for negligence, for emotional distress, and when I'm done with you, you're going to wish you'd just cut down that stupid tree." I remained quiet, watching her work herself into a frenzy. Part of me wanted to tell her right then who I was, but years of judicial temperament held me back. Besides, I had a feeling the situation was going to resolve itself in a way she wouldn't expect. "You have nothing to say?" she demanded. "Typical. You're probably one of those deadbeat homeowners who can barely afford their mortgage. Well, I hope you have a good lawyer because you're going to need one." She turned on her heel, stomped back across my lawn, leaving fresh footprints in the soft ground, and drove off with another screech of tires. I stood there for a moment, looking at the oak tree that had witnessed countless seasons, storms, and now, apparently, the beginning of what promised to be an interesting legal situation. As I went back to measuring fence boards, I couldn't help but wonder how long it would take Rebecca Hartwell to follow through on her threat. In my experience, people like her rarely backed down. They doubled down. And something told me that this oak tree dispute was about to become a lot more complicated than either of us anticipated. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known from looking at me in my weekend clothes covered in sawdust, was that in 3 weeks, when the court calendar rolled around, she was going to get the surprise of her life. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in harassment. It started on Monday morning when I left for work at 6:30 a.m. and found a professionally printed notice taped to my front door. "Official demand letter," it proclaimed in bold red letters. I almost laughed when I read it. Rebecca had hired some attorney from 2 counties over, probably because no local lawyer wanted to touch a case this frivolous, demanding that I remove the oak tree within 14 days or face legal action. The letter cited damages including mental anguish, property devaluation, and my personal favorite, arboreal assault. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my briefcase. At work that day, during a break between hearings, I pulled up the property records on my computer. Just as I'd remembered, the oak tree sat exactly on the surveyed property line, with its canopy extending over both properties nearly equally. The tree was registered with the county's Heritage Tree Protection Program, which I'd actually voted to expand 2 years ago during a county board meeting. Removing it would require approval from the Agricultural Commissioner, an environmental impact report, and probably an act of God. But Rebecca wasn't done. On Tuesday, I came home to find orange spray paint on my driveway, crude arrows pointing toward my house with the words "Tree Killer" painted in large letters. I stood there, still in my suit from court, looking at the vandalism. My neighbor from across the street, an elderly man named George Santos, walked over with his dog. "Judge Mitchell," he said quietly. George was one of the few neighbors who knew what I did for a living. "I saw who did it. That new woman from the Hendersons' old place, around 2 in the afternoon. I got it on my doorbell camera if you need it." "Thanks, George. I might take you up on that." I looked at the orange paint. "Though I'm curious to see how far this goes before it resolves itself." George raised an eyebrow. "You're not going to report her?" "Not yet," I said. Sometimes people need to follow through on their threats to understand how badly they've miscalculated. Thursday, Rebecca had filed a complaint with the Homeowners Association, which was informal at best in our neighborhood, claiming I was maintaining a public nuisance. She'd also posted in our neighborhood's social media group, painting herself as a victim of a negligent neighbor who refused to maintain his property. The post included the photos she'd taken of me that first morning, carefully cropped to make my yard look worse than it was. What she didn't know was that 3 other people on that social media group worked in the courthouse, 2 clerks and a bailiff, and by Friday morning, my chambers were filled with barely suppressed laughter as my staff showed me the screenshots. My court administrator, Linda Hayes, a woman who'd worked in the system for 30 years, shook her head in disbelief. "Judge, she really doesn't know?" Linda asked. "Apparently not," I replied, signing off on a stack of orders, "and I'm not inclined to enlighten her just yet. She's determined to take me to court, so let's see where her determination leads her." That afternoon, I received the small claims court filing. Rebecca had officially sued me for $1,000, the maximum allowed in California small claims court, for property damage, emotional distress, and punitive damages related to negligent tree maintenance. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out on a Thursday afternoon in courtroom 4. I sat at my desk, reading through her handwritten complaint form. Her allegations were creative, I'd give her that. She claimed the falling leaves had damaged her pool filter, stained her deck, and caused her severe anxiety about property value depreciation. She'd attached photos of leaves in her yard, as if autumn was somehow evidence of wrongdoing. The complaint was signed with a flourish. Rebecca Hartwell, plaintiff, representing herself pro se. My law clerk, James Park, knocked on my open door. "Judge, I just saw the new small claims filing. Isn't that your address?" "It is indeed." James's eyes widened. "But sir, when she shows up to court, then she'll learn an important lesson about researching your opponent before filing frivolous lawsuits," I said calmly. "James, I need you to do something for me. Pull the case assignment for small claims that week. Who's scheduled?" James checked his tablet. "That Thursday, Judge Anderson has morning criminal calendar, Judge Chen has civil motion hour, and you have," he looked up, "you have small claims afternoon session." "Perfect." I leaned back in my chair. "Don't change anything. Don't notify anyone. This case will be assigned randomly with all the others that week, and if it happens to land on my calendar," I shrugged, "then that's just how the system works." "Judge, isn't there a conflict of interest?" James asked carefully. "Normally, yes. But the moment I see my own name on the docket, I'll note it for the record and explain the situation." She'll be given the option to continue the case with a different judge or proceed with her case. Everything will be completely by the book. I smiled slightly. I'm just not going to volunteer information she should have discovered herself through basic due diligence. Over the next 2 weeks, Rebecca's campaign continued. She filed noise complaints about my lawnmower, which I used at 10 a.m. on Saturdays, well within legal hours. She called code enforcement to report my fence project as unpermitted construction. They came out, verified I had all proper permits, and left. She even tried to start a petition among the neighbors to force me to remove the tree, which resulted in exactly 0 signatures and several neighbors privately apologizing to me for her behavior. Through it all, I said nothing. I waved politely when I saw her. I continued my weekend projects. And I waited for that Thursday afternoon to arrive, when Rebecca Hartwell would walk into small claims court, ready to present her case against her negligent neighbor, and discover exactly who she'd been harassing for 3 weeks. As the court date approached, Rebecca's confidence seemed to grow exponentially. I'd see her in the neighborhood, often on her phone, loudly discussing her case with whoever would listen. One Saturday morning, while I was watering my front garden, she was in her driveway talking to another neighbor, Margaret Chen, no relation to Judge Patricia Chen, and her voice carried clearly across the quiet street. "Oh, Margaret, you should see my evidence binder," Rebecca announced proudly. 200 pages, fully tabbed and color-coded. I've got photographs, property records, expert quotes for damage repair. I even hired an arborist to document the aggressive root system threatening my foundation. She laughed that particular laugh that wealthy people sometimes have, the one that suggests the world is merely a stage for their victories. This Mitchell guy has no idea what's about to hit him. My attorney friend, well, he's too busy for small claims, of course, but he reviewed my case and said it's absolutely solid. I'm going to walk out of there with a judgment for $10,000 and a court order forcing him to remove that monstrosity. Margaret, bless her, tried to interject. "Rebecca, maybe you should consider mediation? I mean, he seems like a reasonable..." "Reasonable?" Rebecca's voice pitched higher. "He's been completely unresponsive, probably because he knows he's wrong and can't face the consequences. Well, the court will make him face them." She paused, then added with satisfaction, "I looked up the judge scheduled that day. Some guy named Mitchell. Common name, no relation, obviously. According to the internet, he's been on the bench for 15 years, which means he's seen countless negligent homeowner cases. He'll take one look at my evidence and rule in my favor immediately." I turned off my hose and went inside, smiling despite myself. The irony was almost too perfect. She'd researched the judge's name, seen Mitchell, and somehow convinced herself it was just coincidence. The confirmation bias was strong with this one. That evening, I did what I always did before any court session. I prepared thoroughly. Even though I knew Rebecca's case had no legal merit, I wanted to be ready to address every point she might raise. I pulled out the property survey, the county heritage tree regulations, the HOA covenant, and photographs of the tree clearly showing its position on the property line. I also printed out the California Civil Code sections relevant to boundary trees, particularly the section that established equal ownership and responsibility. My wife Jennifer, a high school principal, watched me organize documents at our dining room table. We'd been married for 22 years, and she knew better than to interrupt when I was in preparation mode, but eventually, she couldn't help herself. "Rob, honey, isn't this a bit much for a case you're going to have to recuse yourself from anyway?" She set down a cup of coffee next to my expanding piles of paper. "Maybe," I admitted, looking up at her. "But Jen, here's the thing. When I reveal who I am, she's going to have a choice. She can request a different judge and continue her frivolous lawsuit, wasting everyone's time and money. Or she can drop the case and hopefully learn something about civility and doing basic research. Either way, I want her to see exactly how prepared I am, how seriously I take every case, and how thoroughly I understand the law she's attempting to use against me." Jennifer sat down across from me. "You're going to teach her a lesson." "I'm going to give her an opportunity to learn one," I corrected. "There's a difference. Look, I've been doing this long enough to recognize the type. Rebecca is used to intimidating people into compliance. She's probably been doing it her whole life, with employees, with service workers, with anyone she perceives as having less power than her. The legal system is supposed to be the great equalizer, but she's trying to use it as just another tool of intimidation. And when she realizes you're the judge?" I leaned back in my chair. "Then one of 3 things happens. 1, she's mortified, apologizes, and drops the case. 2, she doubles down, insists on a different judge, and learns the hard way that no judge in this county is going to look favorably on this lawsuit. Or 3, she tries to claim bias and file some kind of complaint, which will go nowhere because I've followed every procedural rule perfectly. I paused. My money's on option 2. The next week crawled by. On Monday, Rebecca left another notice on my door, this one informing me that she expected me to bring my attorney to court and warning me that any attempt to represent myself would result in swift defeat. On Wednesday, she was in her front yard with what appeared to be a professional photographer, documenting every leaf, twig, and acorn that had fallen from the oak tree. Wednesday night, I had dinner with my colleague, Judge Patricia Chen, at our usual spot, a quiet Italian restaurant near the courthouse. Patricia had been on the bench for 20 years and had seen everything. When I told her the full story, she nearly choked on her wine. "Robert, please tell me you're kidding," she said, laughing. "I wish I was. She's genuinely convinced she's going to win $10,000 from me. What are you going to do?" "Follow the rules exactly," I said simply. "When her case comes up on my calendar, I'll identify the conflict for the record. I'll offer her the option to continue with a different judge, and then we'll see what kind of person she really is." Patricia shook her head. "You know, in 20 years, I've never seen anything quite like this. Most people at least Google their opponent before filing suit." "Most people aren't Rebecca Hartwell," I replied. "She's so certain of her righteousness that it never occurred to her to look beyond surface assumptions." That night, I laid out my court attire for Thursday, my standard black robe, pressed and ready. Tomorrow would either be the shortest case on my docket or the beginning of something far more complicated. Either way, Rebecca Hartwell was about to learn that the legal system doesn't care about designer tracksuits, aggressive confidence, or how much you paid for your house. It cares about facts, law, and evidence. And tomorrow, in courtroom 4, at approximately 2:30 p.m., she was going to get a very expensive education in all 3. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of perfect autumn sunshine that seemed almost ironic given what was about to unfold. I went through my usual routine. Coffee at 5:30 a.m., a quick run through the neighborhood where I passed Rebecca's house and saw her lights already on, and then the drive to the courthouse. The building was a modern structure of glass and concrete, designed 10 years ago to replace the aging courthouse from the 1960s. I'd been part of the committee that approved the design, back when I was still a municipal court judge before the county promoted me. My morning calendar was full: a child custody dispute, 2 restraining order requests, and a contentious small business dissolution. By noon, my mind was entirely focused on the work, which is exactly how it should be. During my lunch break in chambers, Linda reminded me about the afternoon small claims calendar. "Judge, you have 23 cases this afternoon," she said, reviewing her tablet. "Most look straightforward: unpaid rent, damaged property deposits, small contractor disputes. But there's one," she looked up with barely concealed amusement, "that involves a tree dispute between neighbors. And sir, the defendant's address is your address." "Is that so?" I asked innocently, finishing my sandwich. "Judge Mitchell, the plaintiff's name is Rebecca Hartwell. She's filed against Robert Mitchell." Linda's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "Should I notify her before the calendar begins?" "No," I said firmly. "I'll handle it in open court, on the record, exactly as procedure requires. She filed this case, Linda. She had every opportunity to research the defendant, me. If she didn't do her due diligence, that's a lesson she needs to learn." At 2:00 p.m., I entered courtroom 4 from my chamber's door. The bailiff, Marcus Thompson, called out, "All rise," and I took my seat at the bench. The courtroom was about half full. Plaintiffs and defendants waiting for their cases to be called, a few attorneys scattered throughout the gallery, and there, in the 3rd row, sat Rebecca Hartwell. She was dressed as if she were attending a corporate board meeting, expensive navy suit, pearls, her hair styled perfectly. She had a rolling briefcase beside her that looked like it could contain the entire Library of Congress. What struck me most was her expression, absolute confidence bordering on smugness. She didn't even glance at the bench when I entered. She was too busy reviewing her notes. I began calling the calendar in order. Small claims court has an informal rhythm. Cases are usually resolved in 10 to 15 minutes, often with both parties agreeing to a settlement once they see the inside of a courtroom. The first case settled immediately. The second required a brief hearing where I ruled in favor of the landlord on an unpaid rent claim. The third involved a fender bender where I split liability 50-50. And then I called, Case number SC 2024-008847, Hartwell versus Mitchell. I watched Rebecca stand up, gathering her massive briefcase. She walked to the plaintiff's table with the air of someone who'd already won, and then she looked up at the bench for the first time, really looked, and our eyes met. The change in her expression happened in stages, like watching a computer process a complicated equation. First confusion, who is this judge who looks familiar? Then recognition, wait, that's the man from the neighborhood. Then denial, no, that can't be right. And finally, horrible dawning comprehension, oh God, what have I done? The color drained from her face. Her mouth opened and closed twice without sound. The briefcase handle slipped from her fingers, and the entire thing tipped over, spilling papers across the floor. The courtroom went completely silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing, waiting to see what would happen next. Ms. Hartwell, I said in my professional courtroom voice, please approach the plaintiff's table, and we need the defendant as well. I paused deliberately. Would the defendant, Robert Mitchell, please approach the defendant's table? No one moved. Rebecca stood frozen, staring at me like she'd seen a ghost. Ms. Hartwell, I continued, I assume you can see the problem we have here. The person you've sued is currently sitting on the bench as the assigned judge for your case. Before we proceed any further, we need to address this conflict of interest for the record. Please approach the table. She finally moved, like someone walking through deep water, and stood at the plaintiff's table. Her hands were shaking as she tried to gather her scattered papers. Let the record reflect, I stated clearly, that the plaintiff, Rebecca Hartwell, has filed a small claims action against Robert Mitchell regarding a tree dispute. I am Robert Mitchell, the defendant in this case, and I am also the judge assigned to this calendar. Ms. Hartwell, were you aware that I am a judge in this county? She stammered. Please speak clearly for the record, Ms. Hartwell. Did you know I was a judge when you filed this lawsuit? No. Her voice was barely a whisper. Did you conduct any research about the person you were suing before filing this case? Silence. Then quietly, I looked up the property records. But you didn't look up the property owner beyond the name? You didn't Google me? You didn't check any public records about who I am or what I do for a living? No. She was crying now, quiet tears running down her perfectly made-up face. I let the moment sit for a few seconds. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum. Then I continued in a gentler but still firm tone. Ms. Hartwell, this presents a clear conflict of interest. I cannot hear a case in which I am the defendant. However, you have filed a lawsuit in good faith, or at least what you believed was good faith, and you are entitled to have that case heard by an impartial judge. Therefore, I am offering you two options. I let her wait, giving her time to process what was happening. Option 1. I can continue this case to a different date and transfer it to another judge in this courthouse. Judge Anderson or Judge Chen could hear your case, and you would present your evidence to them just as you plan to present it to me. If you choose this option, your case will be heard fairly and decided on the legal merits. Rebecca looked up at me, mascara streaking her face. Option 2. You can dismiss this case today, without prejudice, which means you could refile it later if you chose to, though I would strongly advise against it. If you choose this option, we can all walk away from here, and perhaps we can be better neighbors going forward. I want a different judge, Rebecca said, her voice suddenly stronger. The tears had stopped, and something had shifted in her expression. Embarrassment was transforming into defiance. This is entrapment. You deliberately didn't tell me who you were. You set me up. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. I raised my hand slightly, and silence returned. Ms. Hartwell, I need to be very clear about something, I said, my tone remaining professional, but with an edge of steel. When you approached me in my yard 3 weeks ago, I was under no legal obligation to inform you of my profession. When you left threatening letters on my door, spray-painted my driveway, and filed false reports with code enforcement, I was still under no obligation to educate you about who I am. You chose to file a lawsuit. The moment you made that choice, it became your responsibility to conduct due diligence about your opponent. That's not entrapment, Ms. Hartwell. That's basic legal procedure. But you're biased, she insisted, her voice rising. You obviously want me to lose. This whole situation is unfair. You're absolutely correct that I'm biased, I agreed, which is precisely why I'm offering to recuse myself and have your case heard by a completely neutral judge. That's the opposite of unfair, Ms. Hartwell. That's the system working exactly as it should to protect your rights. I paused. So let me ask you again. Do you want to continue this case with a different judge, or do you wish to dismiss? Rebecca straightened her spine. The shock was wearing off and I could see her brain working, calculating. I want a different judge, and I want to add additional claims. You deliberately concealed your identity to manipulate me into making mistakes. That's fraud. I want to amend my complaint to include intentional infliction of emotional distress and fraud. Several people in the courtroom actually gasped. Marcus, my bailiff, shifted his weight, a subtle indication that he thought this was about to go very wrong for Rebecca. Linda, watching from the clerk's desk, closed her eyes briefly as if in pain. Ms. Hartwell, I said carefully, I want to make absolutely certain you understand what you're requesting. You want to continue this case and actually expand your claims against me? Yes, absolutely. Even after I've explained that your original case has no legal merit because the tree in question is on the property line, making it jointly owned under California Civil Code Section 841 and is protected under county heritage tree ordinances? That's for a judge to decide, a different judge, an unbiased judge. And you want to add claims of fraud and intentional infliction of emotional distress against a sitting county judge based on the theory that I should have voluntarily informed you of my profession when you came onto my property and threatened to sue me? Yes. Her confidence was returning, the way a cornered animal sometimes attacks instead of fleeing. And I think there should be an investigation into whether you've done this before. How many other people have you manipulated? This is an abuse of power. The courtroom had gone from silent to electric. This was no longer a simple small claims dispute. Rebecca was essentially declaring war on a member of the judiciary in open court, on the record. I took a slow breath. Very well, Ms. Hartwell. Since you've declined my offer to dismiss, and you've requested a different judge, I will grant that request. Your case will be continued for 30 days and reassigned to Judge Patricia Chen. However, I need to inform you of several things before you leave this courtroom. I pulled up my computer screen and began typing as I spoke. First, I'm going to enter my own responsive filing to your small claims case. Since you're expanding your claims, I'm going to assert all applicable defenses and counterclaims, including but not limited to abuse of process, filing a frivolous lawsuit, trespass for walking on my property without permission, vandalism for the spray paint incident, yes, Ms. Hartwell, I have video footage, and harassment. Rebecca's face went pale again. Second, I continued, your allegations of fraud and intentional infliction of emotional distress against me personally are serious accusations against a judicial officer. I'm required to report this to the Commission on Judicial Performance, who will review whether your claims have any merit or if they constitute an attempt to harass or intimidate a judge. That's their job, not mine. Third, I'm going to provide Judge Chen with a complete record of your behavior over the past 3 weeks, including the threatening letters, the vandalism, the false code enforcement reports, and today's statements in court. Judge Chen will decide if any of that is relevant to your case, but she will have the full context. I stopped typing and looked directly at Rebecca.